Welcome to the StraitJacket Podcast. My name is Matt. This is Jeff, local treatment center owner. Then we have our guest today, Sam, who's going to be talking about her experience with mental health.
Hi.
So, Sam, tell us about how mental health has impacted your life.
I have dealt with a wide array of it between dating, my family, friendships, a lot of depression, anxiety, trauma, PTSD, borderline, pretty much you name it, I've been through it. Therapy, books, meditation, I've been through it kind of across the board for the most part.
So, have you experienced borderline personally, or is that...
I've dated somebody with borderline.
Wow, that's a pretty serious personality disorder. What was that like?
The highs were highs and the lows were lows. They were on antibiotics for it, and when they stopped taking them, you would really see the influx of the roller coaster of their mental health. You could wake up having a perfect day, and then 12 o'clock hits and it's like a storm blew over, and then you stand there kind of questioning like who they are, because it's like they put a mask over themselves and you don't really know who's who, because you're looking at two completely different personas.
You met someone, you get to know somebody, then all of a sudden the next day or the next moment they're just a completely different person.
Mm-hmm. Like a snap of the finger, you don't know when, you don't know why, you don't know how long, and then they snap out of it, and that usually follows with the gaslighting and the romanticizing and the love bombing, and you kind of get in your own head wondering like who you're actually like in a relationship with. And even in friendships the same way. It really can trigger you mentally. Not so much dealing with somebody else, you end up becoming sick yourself.
You kind of start believing the I don't know if I want to call it lies, but like you just don't know what to believe as far as their personality goes, right?
Mm-hmm. You end up building like a fantasy of like what you think they are, and like what you want for yourselves, I guess, so to speak. And it's like an internal battle every day.
Yeah, no, I mean, I feel like a lot of people, and I'm glad that you shared on that, do kind of struggle with toxic relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any more insight on that?
So like, for example, like an episode, I'll never forget, I was in San Francisco when we were driving. He was driving and I was a passenger, and we were in the middle of the highway and like rush hour traffic, and I said something that completely set him off. He chucked a water bottle at me in the front seat, and mind you, we had like a perfect day going forward. It was just like a snap of a finger. Pulls over, basically kicks me out of the car on the side of an on-ramp of the freeway and just drives off. And I had to climb down the side of the freeway and go to a restaurant, and then next thing you know, 2 hours later, calls me like nothing ever happened, like, hey, are you okay? I want to see you, I love you, I'm sorry. And then it's like you're in your head wondering, okay, this person that I'm in a relationship with and who says they love me just literally threw a water bottle and dropped me and didn't really care if I was alive or dead. And then once he's out of an episode, it's like believing, or it's what to believe. And then went home and just went around like about it happy ways, like nothing ever happened that day. It was like that every single day. And it just gets to the point where like you just kind of just stay quiet and keep your head down just to avoid any sort of conflict. Just so, because you start to think that you're the problem and you're instigating it, or you're having a bad day, you're in a bad mood. It's always finger pointing. When it's really not you, it's them. But that's understanding the mental health side of it, knowing and understanding that specific disorder.
it's going to be challenging because it's like you get to know this person, you know who
Thank
they
you,
are when
Mom.
they're not, like, yeah, or you know how they act when they're not in an episode, then all of a sudden they're going through this episode. It's even though you can acknowledge that this is like due to their mental health disorder, it's still coming from them. They're saying it with their words, you know, out of their mouth, and even though you can identify, okay, this person is not like, that's not really them talking, it's still them saying it, so it's all the feelings that come from it, it still hurts, you know, it's still confusing, you know, it's like, you know, it's hard to separate that when you see it coming from them. I mean, I know I've had instances where, in past relationships, where I was under the influence of stuff and I would act and say things that weren't right. Is that how I act on a normal basis? No, but those moments, you know, it still came from me, so it still affected that person as if I said it when I was sober or when I wasn't going through a personal mental health issue.
Mm-hmm.
And so have you ever been, how about personally, how have you struggled with mental health?
I started going through PTSD, like depression therapy, from the time I was probably 14 years old. My parents divorced, and growing up in a household of alcoholism and abuse kind of trickled down to how I was as a kid. And then going through therapy, trying to, you know, go through with specifically family therapists to be able to kind of help me navigate the divorce and splitting homes at 13, 14 years old. And then fast forward 16, my dad passed away. And then having not only family counseling, but now I'm going through grief counseling. And I was put on antibiotics for like Klonopin and Zofran? Zoloft, 16 years old. And then, you know, going through, and they're giving me all these different things, telling me I have this, and just kind of giving, you know, medicine and scripts for it. And again, I'm 16 years old. But for so long, I kind of just used those mental health factors as almost like not a title, but I would take it almost like a personality trait, even though it wasn't, I feel like they weren't doing a lot of things to be able to heal that and talk about it. They just kind of say, oh, well, you know what, like, you lost a parent, you're depressed, well, here's this. Rather than understanding the nature of how it is and what depression and anxiety and all those things actually are. But I started being introduced to that world at a very young age, which then led into me using those and then moving into opiates, and then that's kind of what started my long history of drug use.
I mean, there's a lot there. Well, first off, I'm sorry to hear that your father passed away. I didn't know that. And second, how do you think that, I don't know how to put this really. So I feel like nowadays people are getting diagnosed younger and younger and younger as far as mental health goes, you know. You can be scrolling on your phone and see like so many different things, like anxiety, like little kids having like, you know, autism, anxiety, like all these different things. And I know you're a parent as well.
Mm-hmm.
Hope you don't mind me sharing that. But how do you feel about things being diagnosed so much younger these days?
I think it's wrong. For example, I have a 2-year-old son, and he was behind in a lot of his motor skills and his speech, which was contributed to a rough childbirth. And he was behind, and the doctors were always kind of like weary of him being behind, especially speech. By 2 years old, a kid should be able to say 200 words, and he wasn't even close to that. And it wasn't until he had his 2.5-month checkup where they said now that he can talk, that he is no longer on this on the spectrum to being autistic. And to me, he's 2.5 years old. I don't understand why the topic of autism is being spread around so loosely, because kids are all going to develop at various ages, especially boys develop slower than girls do. And even with kids getting older, 5-6 years old, they may have ADD or ADHD. They're getting Ritalin and Adderall at such a young age, rather than putting them into maybe more special ed classes or hands-on activities that will be able to like fixate them or learn what their struggles are. And as they get older, then those kids that necessarily didn't get the help and nurture that they need are just being thrown into these classes. That's when they're having anger issues, or they're fleeing, or any of those things I think are related to kind of just sliding it under the rug, because they don't want to do the work to fix things. They just want to be like, okay, well, here's this,
here's a pill.
Mm-hmm.
Like kind of like you said, when you were 16 and all this stuff was happening, they're giving you these medications and going to therapy. It kind of became this like you adapted that like personality, or like this was this personality trait that you adapted. So those are like the developmental years of your life, right? Mm-hmm. So like your brain's still developing, so being introduced and told, oh, you have this, you have that, being given medications through a time where your brain's figuring out and maturing, especially going through like a tragic incident like that, it's liable to develop you into that, And do you think like with that being introduced at such a young age, and how that's becoming a thing, because it wasn't a thing like when like our parents were younger, right? Like,
I don't know. I mean, I was prescribed Ritalin since I was like 6 years old, right? I don't know, ADD, ADHD, that seems like kind of something that everybody has. I don't think any of our parents were really prescribed like Ritalin.
At least didn't have it pushed on them, or like you weren't called out for like being like, oh, you got to have this. Like they might have had some behavioral issue, which is a normal thing growing up. Like every kid, every person's going to develop in their own way, in their own time. So throwing that at them and putting a label on them at such a young age during those developmental years, would make sense for like you said, to feel like you had identified with that personality, that became like a personality trait.
I think there's two major problems. Is that to diagnose somebody's mental health, you get a sheet of paper and you pretty much have to do like, are you suicidal, 0 to 5, highly unlikely, highly likely, or say, any questions they may ask, and they're literally going off of a number, and like, I don't think there's a lot of honesty on those papers. I mean, like, if I was feeling some type of way in my life, I don't know if I would be putting a number 5 on a piece of paper for somebody to read and kind of give me a scale on a sliding scale, whether I'm sick or not. And I think too, a lot of those kids that are fleeing and stuff like that, it's coming more so for the way that they're being nurtured at home.
Oh, absolutely.
I think it's important for somebody, especially a male, to be able to share their emotions. And most of the time when a man lashes out, it's that anger is coming from a deep-rooted emotion. And if they were able to express themselves and not have to feel like they're supposed to be this masculine dominant personality, things would be a little bit different. Because of a woman, or like, even like a little girl, she cries, it's okay. But if a little boy cries, well, come on, you're tough. You're not supposed to cry. You're supposed to be strong. That carries on until they're older as well.
Absolutely.
And, when they grow up in that household, that's going to also affect how they're a partner and a parent, and an individual. And I think that also makes, somebody's mental health hinder.
So I wanted to touch a little bit more on your thoughts as far as relationships and mental health go.
In what way? Like, to me...
What you could probably pass on to the youth, or like your advice that you would want to give the youth.
I think I think it just goes back to like almost like black and white. Males are normally providers, they want to pay the bills and support a family and be the working man. Well, women are more so the nurturers. They're usually more of the empaths. They're taking care of the home, they're taking care of their children. And I think that sometimes the upbringing, they're so molded into a role versus understanding that there could be a shift, and like it's okay if, the women take on more of a masculine role and like the men take on more of a feminine role. I think it affects them also in the dating style instead of having to be like more of a, cut this part, I'm losing train. I had like a great train of thought.
Like basically like the role, like the kind of like family dynamics, right? Is how I would think about it. It's like, so the man is the provider and then the woman is like the nurturer. But it seems like, your opinion is that it shouldn't necessarily be like that 100%.
Like black or white.
Yeah.
Yeah, it should be more of like a fluid household and relationships where everyone is kind of pulling 50-50. Even though I guess sometimes no relationship is 50-50, right? Somebody's always going to have to pull a little bit more weight and be open to that.
With certain areas.
Yes. Nothing's ever going to, nothing's ever going to be perfect, and being okay with those imperfections, so to speak. Somebody's going to have a bad day. Somebody's going to, wake up in a bad mood, and not necessarily letting that trickle in and carrying more weight and damage than it needs to be.
How do you think that I guess you could say, we'll call it old school. How do you think that old school family dynamic affects the kids?
I saw something yesterday, and it said when you ask a guy how their day is, they say it's fine. I'm good.
I do.
And then if you ask a woman how their day is, they're like, well, it's fine, but this happened. It's kind of like, it's not necessarily a straight line. It's kind of like a zigzag. It goes all over the place. I think if somebody was able to have more of a safe spot, and I think that's probably the most important thing that most relationships are missing, and maybe a family dynamic, is having a safe place to express yourselves, whether it be, emotionally, physically, mentally, whatever it may be, and allowing them to be able to express themselves without necessarily being called, crazy, or you're an overthinker.
Being looked down on.
Yes, 100%. Like you feeling validated for having whatever feelings you may feel. I think there's a lot of labels now that are being thrown so loosely, like I said, oh, well, she did so, she's crazy. If I'm expressing my insecurities, well, you're just overthinking it. You're overreacting. And those things completely shut down any sort of ability to be able to be vulnerable and to be open about how somebody's feeling. And then when you're being labeled those things, you end up kind of repressing everything and kind of shutting down, or you become more of an avoidant and you just run. As soon as you sense some sort of conflict or chaos, you're out. And that's why people ghost. And that whole ghosting culture has come about because people don't want to face their emotions or don't want to face any sort of issue, so they just run. And they're going to keep running and running and running until they can't run anymore. People go through the same toxic relationships because they don't want to change because they're comfortable, and change is more intimidating than just staying in a toxic circle where you're just going through the same thing over and over and over. And if any of you have been in a toxic, abusive relationship, you know that you can't get out until you're ready to get out. You could go to your friends 1,000 times and tell them how much, you can't stand so-and-so or so-and-so did this, but if you're not ready to leave, you're not gonna leave. I think it takes a woman, 7 or 8 times in abusive relationship to be able to leave. And to me, that's a lot, you know. And there's an article that that starts off, well, you know, I stayed, but he never hit me. And understanding that, you know, when you're in an abusive relationship, it doesn't always have to be physical. It can be, you know, verbal, it can be emotional, it can be psychological, and I don't think that's talked about enough at all. You know, somebody might not, you know, I might not get hit in the face, but I could be completely berated, you know, on a verbal level. Well, you're not doing this enough, or you're not good enough, or you did this wrong. And those emotional heals and those verbal scars, I feel like take longer to heal than the physical ones. The physical ones leave a bruise and they'll go away, but the emotional ones stay. You know, even if you've been in like a bad relationship 10 years ago, if they say one thing that really gets to you, you're still going to remember that thing. It's going to carry on with you. And if you don't heal those things and be able to like understand the root of them and know that maybe you're not actually at fault, it's them, it will help your healing process and where your head, you know, mentally, to be able to heal and go forward.
What are some things that you've done to heal?
Well, like I said, I've gone through a lot of therapy, you know, both with grief therapy, family therapy, like PTSD therapy, strictly focus on not only drug and alcohol, but also sexual abuse. But also I think, you know, therapy could be labeled at multiple things, right? You know, I've done reading, I've done writing, I've had like, kind of like a self-help coach, across the board. I think it's a case-by-case basis. Everyone's gonna be able to speak on their feelings a little bit differently. You know, what's gonna work for me might not work for you and might not work for you. Just kind of depends on how you cope and how you grieve. Because grieving has multiple processes. It's not just a textbook way to go through it.
Not everybody gets the opportunity, or you know, mental health is just not talked about a lot these days. So you go through these things, but you're not taught these like coping mechanisms. And if you didn't develop them when you were a kid, it's like, how do you deal with this stuff? Like you were saying, how like in those past relationships where you're getting berated with all these things, being told what you did wrong, all this stuff. It's stuff you kind of you start to believe almost. At least, you know, from what I've heard and what I've seen in other people. You know, the more you start to believe it, the more it becomes kind of your personality, or you identify with it. And if you don't get help for that, you kind of get stuck in that mindset, you know. And I think that's why a lot of people get stuck in those same types of relationships, because they never truly heal from them. Like you said, that bruise, that'll go away. You know, that heals naturally, but the stuff on the inside, like it takes actual work, you know, whether it be with a therapist or any other type of modality, like the self-help books and all different kinds of things. I mean, I know I've dealt with certain things in life, and like, you know, as a guy, I don't like to deal with my emotions, so I'm big at shoving them down and just trying to pretend they're not there. But when I do that, they're still there. You know, it pops up later on in life in different circumstances, you know, but yeah.
That's why mental health goes so hand in hand with addiction, because people are always looking at a temporary fix to fix permanent problems.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of those things, you know, just like you said, like they're gonna start to seep up through the cracks. Doesn't matter how many times you try to push them back down, they're gonna come back up until you know, face them. There's a saying that you can't bleed on people who didn't cut you. And I think that goes a long way, because I personally have done it multiple times, you know, and it's something that I've had to learn, that it's not just because somebody did something, it doesn't mean that not everyone's going to do it. But I do think that, you know, like I said, mental health and addiction goes hand in hand, because people are going to try to find temporary fixes to not necessarily feel or face the things that they've gone through. something to numb them out or make them kind of escape from reality, which I've done for sure, and I think we all have.
Yeah, I mean, I almost think that it kind of seems like society conditions us, or at least the society that we live in conditions us to want that quick fix. It's like, you go to the doctor and then you tell them these symptoms and it's like, okay, here's a pill.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think as we get older, we start to think, okay, I'm having these problems, there must be some type of pill, basically. I mean, that pill can come in all sorts of different forms, like drugs, alcohol, whatever, but just like whatever the temporary relief could be is what we're typically looking for. So as far as you, I wanted to touch a little bit about your experience with addiction as well. From what you've told us so far, you did opiates, right?
Mm-hmm.
How did that start?
I started using pills at a young age when I got them from the doctor, before my dad had passed away, and kind of right after that. And I was kind of abusing the Klonopin, and I remember I was selling the, little things in high school just to get a few bucks, not really knowing what I could and couldn't do. But I started kind of experiencing more with opiates. My mom had a surgery, and she had her gallbladder removed, and she was prescribed oxycodone, and she didn't think anything of it. She left him in her medicine cabinet, and at that time I started drinking at probably 13 years old. My dad was an alcoholic, and he would make me a drink just like he'd make himself a drink. I'd be sitting in the office doing, homework, and I'd be drinking a screwdriver, as a teenager. It's just something that I just thought was normal. And so as my drinking had progressed, I started experimenting with pills and, for the oxys, and, I kind of liked the way I was feeling, especially mixing the two. I didn't know any different. And then things started getting bad. I overdosed. I ended up taking 5 80-milligram oxycodone.
At what age?
I was 17 years old. I was 2 weeks after graduating high school. And that was after losing my dad. We were placed I had not talked to my mom in 7 months. My dad was taking full custody of me just because he could. And so my whole life pretty much just changed overnight. I was bullied in school for losing my dad. I lost my virginity right after he passed away, so a lot of the kids in school pretty much said that, they called me a slut and a whore because they said that I was using it as a crutch, and I think that kind of shaped me into the person I kind of became. Then, that was a tail end of 17, and then I had overdosed. My mom found me in my bed, and I remember very vaguely they worked on me in my bed, and the paramedics carried me down the stairs, took me in the hospital. I was in the ICU for 2 days on machines, and they told my mom that I wasn't gonna make it. From there, they were able to stabilize me and then immediately moved me into a psych ward because they considered it, since it was such a lethal amount, that I had tried to kill myself. And since I was 17 years old, I wasn't a legal adult in the state of New York, which is where I'm from. So I was 5150, and I remember that I stayed in a room, and it was 2 twin beds, couldn't even have a pen, couldn't have any personal belongings of mine, and that's how I lived. And I ended up having to come out about a lot of things. I wasn't allowed to see anybody except my mom, and again, I was 2 weeks out of high school. I ended up getting out and telling my mom I was gonna stay sober and everything. I was prescribed Subutex and ended up going into college the next month. This would have been in July at that point. Went into school, and then I just kept using drugs. I was introduced to cocaine and was using that pretty relentlessly, and I ended up getting to the point where I just didn't really care at all. Felt like I was just trying to heal from, losing a father figure and understanding who I was, as a 18-year-old kid. I ended up dating somebody, and I started kind of seeing the light in things, and then in a matter of weeks, he ended up dying overseas. He was in the Army, and he died by an IED, and he was 21. So after that pretty much threw me into a rabbit hole of just, I wasn't coming home to school, and mind you, I was living at school at this point. So the dean of the school sat me down and pretty much told me that you either need to go into treatment or you're getting kicked out of school. So I went into treatment and cleaned up my act. I was sober for about 2 years at that point, up until about 2012. For the length that I was still in school, dropped out, and then I had been dating somebody else at that point, and he ended up being murdered. He overdosed. It was an accidental overdose, and instead of his roommates taking him to the hospital a mile away, they took his body, dumped him on a park bench, stripped him naked, and left him with an empty, open wallet. And he left behind a 3-year-old daughter. And so that is really, really screwed me up for a long, long time. Moved out west, wanted to start something new. Again, found myself in another abusive relationship. We had lived together at that time. I was still sober at this point. And then at the tail end of things, when I was trying to leave him, he held a loaded shotgun to my head on his 21st birthday, and it took 3 people to get the gun away from him, and that was pretty much my tipping point. And after that, I relapsed on alcohol and cocaine. At this point, I was using to the point where I was selling locally in town. I was going back and forth to Vegas to pick up. I started prostituting myself just to be able to get pills and drugs and cocaine at this time. Ended up getting away from him. I was homeless for 2 months, and then I kind of hit a rock bottom. Moved to Colorado, picked up all my stuff, and just lived out of a hotel out there. Again, was sober for about 5 months trying to get my life together. Met the wrong person. I suffered a knee injury at this time, and then after having the knee injury, went to the doctor, and then that's when they prescribed me hydrocodone and oxycodone again, and I relapsed, and I was just a zombie at this point. Relapsed on coke as well, and I was just using the 3 of them. I couldn't even function. I had no job. I was fired as soon as I walked into my job on crutches. They let me go on the spot, so I had no job. Lost my place to live. I was literally like a vegetable on the couch, just high all day. Got to the point where I called my mom one day, and I was like, I need to come home. I can't live my life like this anymore. And I've been sober now for 9 years.
Congratulations.
Thank you. My sobriety date is conveniently my ex's anniversary of when he passed away. So I just I stay sober now for my son, because I can't go back to that life. When I moved home, my skin was yellow, my eyes were black, and I was about 80 pounds.
Wow.
And seeing the look in my mom's face, I don't ever want to see that again, because it's like looking death in the face. But now I'm here. I'm healthy, but it was a rough time in my life for many, many years.
Yeah, you definitely touched on a lot of topics there that I think could help a lot of different people. What do you think helped you get through all of that? Because I mean, most people would honestly fold.
That's a lot of things to deal with. It wasn't just like, I mean, even just dealing with one of those incidents by itself is a lot for one person. But one after another, I mean, I can't even imagine.
You get exhausted. Honestly, I feel like you hit a point where you just can't keep running from things. It's kind of why I was saying I used to flee from everything, and I used to constantly, like run from couch to couch and person to person, and like you just get so broken down, and there's like little glimpses of when you're sober, and you feel like the guilt and the doubt, and like it just gets to be so overbearing where like you don't want to feel that anymore. I never wanted to die. I just wanted to feel numb. I didn't want to feel the feelings I felt, but I realized that when I was sober and like when things were like okay for like a few hours, then I'd start to feel everything. It got to the point where like I couldn't, no matter how much I put in my body, I couldn't hide the things anymore. It wasn't working. So I had to kind of switch things up. It was really hard for me when I was at Dave's funeral, and there was a bunch of us after the funeral. It was an open casket, and seeing his daughter there, and mind you, she's 3 years old. I have almost a 3-year-old now. I can't even imagine. And when we had to go bury the casket, I don't even want to get emotional, but they were lowering the casket, and she ran and jumped onto the casket. Like, it's so hard to see that. And she just kept screaming, "Daddy, Daddy." And like, how do you can't like help it. Like, you can't hide when you see stuff like that. And like, I just didn't want that for myself anymore.
It's
I'm
a tough
speechless
thing.
after that.
Yeah.
That was really powerful.
I did not mean to start crying.
See if we got any tissues or anything.
I mean, it seems like you kind of like use this as something positive for your, kids, for your kid, and like have a positive impact.
I'm good, I swear. Thanks.
It seems like that you're turning this into something positive though, but it sounds like that you've been through a really tough, I hate saying like a tough life, but like you've been through a lot of really tough situations that not a lot of people would be able to get to the other side of. Is there anything that you would want to pass on as far as like hope goes, or what would you want to pass on to, I don't know, what message would you want to pass on to like your kid or like somebody that is potentially going to go, or maybe potentially going through the same thing?
I think it's cliche, but like, it does get better. And it's hard to see the light when everything's so dark around you. And like, they say that there's always a light at the end of the tunnel, and I do believe that's the truth. It may take time, but kind of to trust the process, because so many times I've been through stuff, and like I grew up in a middle class, upper class upbringing. I had a good life. I didn't grow up on the streets. I didn't grow up the way a lot of the kids do nowadays. I was very fortunate, and like I still went through the things I went through. I think people need to be more patient and kind to themselves and give them more grace, that even on the bad days there's good days to follow, and even on the good days there's going to be bad days to follow, and understanding, you kind of have to just, like I said, you just need to be patient with yourself.
I wanted to touch a little bit on the bullying that you had talked about. I guess after your father passed away.
Mhm.
I think it's a really big topic right now, especially with all these different forms of social media. You know, you really can't escape people these days anymore, right? Like, you can go home from school, but like, you know, you're still gonna have access to your phone,
Mhm.
and like with access to your phone, like there's still potential for bullying. Did you want to touch a little bit about that, how you overcame it, and everything like that?
It makes me sad that, you know, like growing up, I mean, I graduated when we didn't really have phones, you know, like we didn't have the social media access that people have nowadays, and now I feel like people just are keyboard warriors and they just hide behind their phones and they say horrible, horrible things, but if they were in the same room right now with us, they wouldn't say anything. I think understanding that the people that are saying those things, it's not you, it's them. You know, they're unhappy with themselves, and the only way that somebody's gonna tear you down is projecting their own feelings about themselves. And I think it's important to realize that it's, even though they could say the most hurtful things, those things aren't true, and it takes a lot of work and self-confidence to understand that. But it really makes me sad that people, that's like their first resort, you know? Like, I don't know, I was never raised to understand how people can like just completely just tear down somebody else with like no remorse, no nothing. And you see these kids that are, you know, 12, 13 years old committing suicide. It blows my mind because it could have been completely preventable. And I wonder, like, where are these kids' parents? You know, like, to me, you're born to love, but you learn to hate. So, like, where did it go wrong? I think understanding also love languages is very big. It also affects how people handle relationships and friendships. You know, how you perceive love versus how you give love. It's kind of tricky, I guess, but
That's what I'm here for. I kind of know what you mean though, because like I was reading something the other day, and it was like it had to do with love. It was like I think maybe it was attachment. Love languages, like the opposite of something was love, was like what your love language is. Kind of like how you're describing. So like the things that affect me, that I don't know.
Yeah.
I was going somewhere with that. But I don't know.
I think the biggest thing I struggled with is having like a father figure, right? Or you could say like daddy issues, right? I always and I still find myself doing it to this day. I accept love from men because I never received it. That usually goes for anybody that works in the sex industry. You know, like I said, I've done prostitution, I've escorted. You know, I've never been a dancer, but I mean, I've solicited myself for sure. You know, you become completely numb to the fact that you have something offered than more than just your body. And unfortunately, when you know, guys gamble or they have, you know, sex addictions, usually underlying, you know, the other things that follow. But I think it's a lot more common than people make it out to be. You know, nowadays everyone has OnlyFans. It's way more acceptable now versus 10 years ago if you were working in the porn industry or you were escorting or anything like that. I mean, everyone pretty much does it, and it's a lot more normalized. But before, people don't talk about it. You know, STDs, STIs, stuff like that, there's a lot of shame that goes behind that stuff. And to me, there wouldn't be so much shame if people were just open and honest about it. It creates a very nasty stigma. It's that too also, you know, goes back to the bullying. You know, men are gonna call women sluts and whores, but there's no different than a man sleeping with 20 women and being, you know, kind of made to look like some hero amongst his friends. But if a woman sleeps with 20 guys, you know, she's a whore. it's really sad to see the divide. It's like the first thing, you know, somebody will throw shame at, even though there's nothing, to me, there's nothing that should be shameful about it. It's just, it's a natural thing that two adults do.
There's a lot of men that will throw shade at it, but given the opportunity, probably would have done it
They're
themselves.
the ones
you
doing
know,
it.
or supporting it. You know, it's, you know, it doesn't make any sense, but you know, it just comes down to that's just a personal issue within themselves. You know, or you know, how they were raised. You know, having that like more of a bully mentality where you maybe weren't treated the best growing up, so now you don't treat other people the best. So you see something, you can give somebody a hard time about, and you know, like even like in school, like you know, sometimes you make fun of a kid, right? Or you know, then that person, there's a group that's going to be laughing behind the scenes, like you know, it almost becomes a thing. It's like you know, way for them to feel validation, like oh yeah, you know, made fun of this kid, now you know, so and so and so and so are giving me validation for you know being that guy, and it's just a sad world.
So just in a few short words, would you explain what brought you here today?
I wanted to kind of not only make changes in my own life, but not only as a victim of domestic violence and you know, sexual abuse, but I'm also a survivor of that. And so many men and women don't necessarily have the ability to find their voice, and I have. And so I want to be on the flip side of things and be able to give others a voice that I didn't have when I was going through it. And like when I didn't see that there was necessarily a way out, I can tell you that there is, because I'm standing here, proof that you know there is. And it makes me sad when people don't think that there are options out there. There's outlets, there's people you can talk to, there's resources, there's places you can go. There's so many different options. And I think it's important to speak on those things, because it's, you know, when you're in it, you don't see any way out. But being able to hear other people's stories, I think it allows somebody to be empathetic, be like, hey, listen, she did it, I can do it too. And I want to be able to do that for other people, especially, you know, being a single mom, you know, and I want to be an example for my kid as well. You know, if I'm doing those things, and I'm not going to be a mom, and I don't want him to grow out without a parent like I did, but I want to make sure it's, you know, I didn't have a choice, you know. I want him to be able to know that I have a choice, if that makes sense.
Empowerment.